Good morning and welcome to another video cast from Hendy Consulting, the specialist firm in management consulting to the $150 billion display industry. And this morning I wanted to cover my thoughts from the recent OLED summit, which was organized in San Francisco by Smithers and is a gathering of the OLED industry. It's also held alongside the Quantum Dots and Phosphors Forum, which I may seek to in the next few days cover in the same sort of way. So OLEDs today are a $45 to $50 billion industry, which is predominantly in smartphone, but also has a pretty large business in television. And so it was a review of where the industry is and where it's going. So the breakthrough changes now are new large panels, so Gen 8.7 capacity coming along from Samsung in a couple of years' time, which will change the economics for OLED for notebooks, monitors and tablets, and will spur growth in that space, coupled with then the availability of a new phosphorescent blue from UDC, which should also have impact on battery life, but also how people use OLEDs. So these are sort of positive trends overall, even though 2022 was actually a general setback year for the OLED industry, with OLED penetration in smartphones actually falling against LCD, with real pressure on component bill of materials in 5G handsets and forex issues between the dollar and renminbi. Then these all meant that people traded down in smartphone displays back towards LCDs. But otherwise, the picture is a big picture one is of growth. UDC did their usual pitch on phosphorescent blues. There was actually quite some coverage on multi-layer stacks, which I found really fascinating. It's been there in the background, but it certainly came to the front in this conference. Also, there was a discussion on OLEDs potentially being lower power, particularly for high color gamut than other technologies, and that was an interesting perspective. There were at least two talks on ray tracing outcoupling and the use of reflective bank materials in improving the effective EQE of OLED or other emissive displays like that. Pete Palamaki did his own about QD-OLED, and Robert Visser, also a friend, did a piece of work on simulations for outcoupling efficiency. And this was sort of it's certainly outcoupling has been there as a theme for quite a while, but it was interesting that this has come back at this time. And then finally, I wanted to finish off with my recap of a comparison of the two market strategies between LGD and Samsung at this point in time, and my point of view on those. So essentially, OLED is at a 45 billion industry today, a bit of a setback in terms of smartphone this year, but further growth expected in the future. So the conference opened with Jason Hartlove actually giving a relatively technology agnostic point of view on the role of quantum dots as a color converter as compared to OLEDs and narrowband phosphors. And I thought this was very appropriate, given that he and I opened the conference and it was supposed to be one covering all of those technologies. My own slide there is actually how red, green and blue are reached with different technologies. And my own point that was market experimentation and plurality are things that are going on in the display industry at the moment. There are many different ways to get to wide color and high dynamic range. The discontinuities we've mentioned, so the manufacturing one is important, and that's SDC and Allvac finally cracking how to do Gen 8 fine metal mask for OLED, which will change the cost structure of OLED panels at mid-size, and so we should see an awful lot more OLED panels for notebooks, monitors and tablets coming after then. So SDC will lead, but other companies are jumping on the bandwagon too. And then UDC's phosphorescent blue emitters, where they're still talking about 2024 for commercialization, and that will make a difference also. But Omdia very well presented that actually 2022 was a down year for OLED compared to LCD in smartphones in particular, and that cost pressures were meaning people switching back from high-end OLEDs into LCDs for the use in smartphones. As a separate one, and this is really outside of OLED, and I was fascinated by the whole question of what are the limits of color gamut, and actually a very nice talk from Avantama that was basically trying to pitch that perovskite green quantum dots coupled with KSF red phosphors could actually give the biggest color gamut. And I've certainly seen them pitch this idea before. They've been always talking about jade greens, but it was certainly very interesting for me. And then in the bottom right here, trying to pitch the different technologies against each other for color gamut and brightness, which was really interesting to see that done. So UDC did their usual talk. As you know, it's long-term R&D for OLED materials, and the big thing they're working on for launch soon is their phosphorescent blue material. But they did talk a little bit again, and this is the second year I've heard it, on plasmonic OLEDs in terms of a new structure and mechanism using plasmons to getting to even higher EQEs for OLED. So certainly OLED materials are not done yet, and one of the leaders here is pushing technology even further. There was actually quite a lot of discussion on multi-layer stacks, and I certainly found that interesting. I'm trying to get my head around some of that. Some claims on what it does to both brightness and power. Clearly, from a manufacturing cost perspective, multi-layer stacks are more expensive, but some claims on higher brightness and not necessarily higher power. And then a very nice talk also on the role of multi-layer single color stacks for giving really high brightness tail lights for automotive. So that theme certainly came through to me. The other pitch which surprised me a little, though, was again discussion on power and OLED. This graph is a little tricky to read through, but it's basically arguing like for like the power output in a television for OLEDs could be quite considerably less than a similar color gamut LCD. Two different talks on outcoupling and brightness enhancement, and in fact LGD also discussed brightness enhancement using microlens arrays. But Robert Visser, my friend, gave a talk from AMAT on their work on bank structures, reflective bank structures and filler materials to actually improve the effective EQE of an OLED display, and that was certainly interesting. And then Pete Palamaki doing something really similar for QD OLED, but that actually eventually also talks about the role of scattering agents and reflective banks in terms of improving brightness of these displays. So then let's talk about the two main leaders. LGD versus Samsung. LGD gave a very good talk. I mean, they are the OLED leader for television. They certainly have a product lineup, top left here, that is substantially broader than SDC. But their pitch was around three angles. OLED for gaming, transparent OLED, and then portable OLED. And in particular, they outlined use cases for transparent OLED. And I have to say, I wasn't completely sold on all of them. The typical one that's used for transparent OLED is retail point of sale, which is shown here in the bottom left. And that one I accept, though I don't know that it's a huge marketplace. But they also tried to pitch sort of train windows and mobility applications, which you see on the bottom right, and also sort of home lifestyle, non-black monster, I think they called it, type implementations. But you've always got the question of sort of color gamut and washout sort of effects with transparent televisions in that sense. So I have to say, while I'm going to be fascinated to see how this one goes, I'm not sold on all of the application spaces for this yet. Whereas when I saw Dr. J.S. Che's talk, and if anybody hasn't seen that, I suggest you go look for it on YouTube. It's fascinating. The Samsung OLED strategy really seemed to be much more solid to me, and potentially the better one. Clearly, the breakthroughs in Gen 8 OLED for mid-size panels, really important. They're also making a real call to the OLED industry for automotive and saying to the automotive players, we're open for business. And then they're also, I think, looking at some sort of OLED on silicon for micro displays for AR, VR. So it was actually quite a mind-blowing talk, and that's separate to the conference, but is worth other people going to have a look at. So that for me was the summary. OLED's doing very well, it's still growing, a slight down year in 2022 due to cost pressures in 5G handsets, and potentially also due to Forex issues, but overall new manufacturing approaches, materials, and actually an emphasis now on outcoupling and power coming to the front. Tandem stacks also, which I found very fascinating. And then the two different leaders of the industry actually presenting very different outlooks on how to get to the future. And I have to say, while I was involved in setting up LG Display, so my fondness will always be there, I find the Samsung approach slightly stronger.